Kathy adores the minuet, the ballet russe, and Craig Suzette. But Patty likes to rock and roll, the hot dog makes her lose control. What a wild duet. Still they're cousins. Identical cousins all the way. They laugh alike, and times they even talk alike. You can lose your minds when cousins are two of a kind. The end of the Civil War was near when quite accidentally a hero abruptly seized retreat to victory. His medal of honor pleased and thrilled his proud little family true. While pinning it on some blood was spilled, and so it was planned he'd command F Troop, where Indian fights and colorful sights, and nobody takes a licking, where pale face and both turn chicken. When drilling and fighting get them down, you know the morale can boo. As long as they all could relax in town, and then begin with a bang and a boom. F Troop. That was a good one. That's one thing you don't get anymore. Wacky comedies about America's genocidal past. That's for sure. Don't get those so much anymore. The last time anyone tried it was the amazingly ill-conceived show that I believe they showed on the WB before it was the CW, called The Secret Diary of Desmond Pfeiffer, which starred Chi McBride and was about Abraham Lincoln's black butler. And like all the jokes were about like slavery. Pretty wild. You know, somebody's mentioning Air America. I haven't watched that movie since I was a kid. And I don't know, I want to watch it again, honestly, just to see like how frank its depiction of CIA drug trafficking in the Golden Triangle it is. Because it is wild they made a movie about that. But, you know, they also made a movie about Barry Seal. And if anybody has seen American Made with Tom Cruise, it's pretty well done. You know, he's very charismatic. And, of course, the story's got lots of interesting stuff in it. But it's fundamentally handicapped by this restrictor plate in its analysis of, like, the U.S. government role. Like, it is very specific to point out that the CIA knew what the Contras were doing, at most. And not even everyone in the CIA. Really just, like, potentially the case officer, because they sort of depict this guy, the CIA creep played by Domhnall Gleeson, and he does a great job of playing a CIA creep, because they are just these like psychotic pencil pushers, and he does that very well. They kind of set him up as the fall guy, as sort of somebody who was out on his own stick, and even then, all he was doing was overlooking drug trafficking and allowing SEAL to participate in it, and not actually directing or profiting from it himself or for the agency. And so it does make you feel like, even, you know, years later, and even when revealing this stuff in narratives like this is part and parcel of maintaining cultural capitalist hegemony. I mean, in a country like ours, you can't have a thing like Air America, you can't have a thing like CIA drug trafficking just happen and then people know about it, and then it not being metabolized by the broader culture. Because when this stuff gets out and everybody knows it, that means everybody includes the artistic classes, the dream weavers, who are a key component of creating the cultural diffusion of capitalist ideology. And of course, they don't see themselves that way. You can't, because otherwise you couldn't participate in it. And at the end of the day, it beats digging ditches, and it's a flight. It is the natural flight towards away from exploitation, basically. Certain people are able, through luck, mostly luck, and a little bit of skill, charisma, whatever, to be able to make it telling stories instead of having to directly participate in exploitation, like of themselves, doing shitty physical labor that's painful, or even doing bureaucratic work that is not painful physically but is mentally destructive, like literally sapping your will to live because of the boredom it imposes. One way or the other, those are all fates to be avoided if they can be, and people flee away from alienation. And the ones who find themselves in entertainment, part of the reason they're there is because of their revulsion at what the system is. And like the ones who are maybe working class are coming there like, oh, I dodged a bullet there. But for the very successful people in the industry, like the actual economic face, the business of entertainment, and also the talent, as it were, because they mostly are going to have grown up in the middle class, the ascendant post-war middle class, they're going to see through the looking glass of capitalism and recognize themselves in the potential boss. Like they take it for granted that they would be successful, that they would have money, that they wouldn't be physically or mentally exploited. They would be the ones doing the exploitation. And so they seek to avoid guilt. And this is why entertainment is going to be liberal, because the desire to absolve oneself of guilt is the prime psychic driver of liberalism, as opposed to conservatism, reaction, whatever you want to call it, the other pole of the capitalist psyche, which is to deny guilt, deny the existence of guilt. Those are and their politics flow from that, and they both try to enact socially for a liberal subject with money and power and position within a putative democracy. They have actual influence, and they're going to determine what it is. And so people in entertainment, they broadly want to avoid that, They want to avoid being indicated in it. And because it's a guilt-based thing, if they feel like they're telling the stories of capitalism, if they feel like they're helping capitalism succeed, helping all of its worst manifestations continue their, cancerous eating away at the human soul, no, they don't want to sell out. That's the fear of selling out. That was what it always was. And selling out became the prime paranoia of the 90s, precisely because we saw the edge of history happening, coming in front of our faces, and the recognition that, declining conditions under capitalism are all we're going to have. Like, this is the apogee. How are we going to handle that slide? Are we going to sit to the sidelines and maybe critique from outside culturally in a way that we convince ourselves is going to have a cumulative political effect? Or are we going to willingly sell our souls to capital itself so that we have security and money, but we also have this new blot on our soul? And it's the revulsion at that, the possibility of having to accept that brand that marked that 90s phobia of selling out. But of course now it's relevant. Everyone knows that the lifeboat is already sinking. There's no future for this thing, so there's no fantasy of advancement. So the question is, what do you do in the here and now? But anyway, this is to say all the bad stuff that the CIA does, that the U.S. government does, eventually gets out. And when it gets out, it becomes diffused throughout people based on education and access to communication nodes. And that means people in entertainment, more than anybody else, are going to be twitching and perceptive to shit that flows through because they are positioned against the authority system. They imagine themselves in some way against a system. Sometimes it's just in the form of the studios they work for, or the capital formations that they are beholden to, or the broader American government, or capitalism more abstractly. Like, however you understand it, whatever face you're looking at it, you can emotionally and artistically define yourself against it. And so when they hear about this stuff, it's going to get into movies. Everybody at every level is going to be like, I'd like to see that. Even the bean-counting scumbag executives who've got to write a check, they recognize the broader trends in culture and say, oh, this is a story people want to hear. So there's money to be made. Now, in the vulgar Gramscianism that we live with now, there's this fantasy that, this is Lenin's quote about the bourgeois selling the ropes that will hang them to you. Like, oh, like creating this mass media apparatus that is going to cut your throat because we're going to be in charge of it and we're going to direct it at mobilizing the masses against you. Like, this is the liberal fantasy of revolution that is not grounded in class struggle, because it can't be. It cannot be grounded in class struggle because these people are diffused throughout classes with different relationships to capitalism, most of them closer to like artisans, and as such, just not able to have the compatibility of basic interests that exist within the proletariat, broadly speaking. And the thing is, like, there is hope there in organizing those people, but this cultural conflict that is happening, and that sort of is defining it, fundamentally cannot determine the outcome because of its resistance to being incorporated into a working class movement. The working class movement is going to have to sort of emerge in conflict with it and to the sort of orthogonally to it and break through it. Because look what we get. We get the CIA drug trafficking. But how do we get it? We get it couched. We get it softened. We get it smoothed out. There's a combination of the self-interest of the people who fund it, the shared delusion of the audience itself that doesn't want to accept broadly, culturally, these implications, because again, this audience is not the working class. This audience is American media consumers. And that is not a group of people who are linked by a common relationship with capital, which is what a class is, and like in the as close to objective form as you can get. That is what a class is. People who share a relationship to capital. The media consumption class, that is also the political class, that is also like the center of the small holders of America, the remaining percentage of Americans who are still holding on to a shard of the yeoman expropriation, the great turning in America into this machine of surplus based on labor exploitation of slaves and of expropriation of natives, that allows for this middle class society that synthesizes and sublimates the class conflict of old Europe into something that is actually compatible with mass democracy, which it is not in Europe, which is what World War II proved. We created a machine that could handle that kind of crisis because the cushion within the political system, the lubricant created by this free real estate floating around. And the crisis of the political crisis we're at the end stage of is that deal, that yeoman deal, slowly evaporating in the face of changing material conditions, which is the situation where the U.S. is no longer able to just exploit endlessly outside of the calculus of capitalism. Now, because we're part of a closed global system, we are now profit making must be axiomatically cannibalistic. And American capitalism was not that, which is why it survived the 40s in opposition to European capitalism. But that's because of free real estate. And now the free real estate is gone, but there's still this group of people who hold on to it, mostly in the form of their family's home equity, for whatever you want to call the middle class, those people who don't have a shared relationship to production, but share the fact that they do not actually hold like meaningful capital outside of their property. Small holders, literally. Like the last feudal remnant that couldn't be just blasted away by the hoses of capitalism because it was too close to its heart. It had to be euthanized over a long period of time. And that euthanization starts with the American Revolution and has continued now into this fatal death spiral where there can be where democratic legitimacy is being dissolved from within by this acid of immiseration, this downward trajectory of the American middle class, aka political class, aka media consuming class. So that means that even though there's money to be made in telling the truth about capitalism as an artist, the more money that goes into that production, therefore, the more likely it is to be seen somewhere that is a high capital outlay media venture, like film or television, mass media. This is, of course, before the internet, which changes everything. We'll talk about that too later if we want to, but here we're talking about the formation of like post-World War II mass media that people my age really, so this is all I can talk about, still cling to as something that's like has real magic to it, that still has, you know, some of what's the word? Walter Benjamin talks about it in Art in the Age of Mechanical Production. It's the felt presence, it's the felt energy of a real piece of art. I forgot what the fuck, it's in there. Somebody remind me. We still have that. Aura, I think he called it. Yeah, it's a real aura. We have a real aura on things like film. I do anyway, and television. Now the new kids, the Zoomers, this is the end of the chain where this is all shattered into a million pieces in the form of this, you know, narcissistic social media where the sort of craft, the middle class craft, the indulgent post-World War II aesthetic environment of like modernism and then postmodernism, that has no appeal to them. It's passé. All the energy is gone. All the aura has departed. They now can only recognize like their reality. They can no longer maintain the fantasy that there is a distinction between the spectacle and our real lives. Meaning, like, we cannot find any real meaning or like any meaning at all in symbolic representations of life. We can only have it in symbolic, we can only have it in exact mirror-like mimicry of life. We have to shatter the line between spectacle and existence, because it's the only way to invest spectacle with enough emotional energy to make up for the screaming misery that is ever more impairing everyone's ability to function. And the thing that is totally sublimated out of our political system into social pathology. So we're at the point where, like, you can honestly say, like, the metaverse will just be sort of a ironic cap, or will just be like the cap on that, because in many ways we've been in the metaverse for a while now. I'd say about the last 20 years. And it's going to take more than acting within the confines of the metaverse to change anything. It's going to take genuinely unplugging. And that means, you know, committing yourself to non-spectacular forms of political action. Unspectacular action. I guess that's what we're looking to create. And the thing is that the conditions are going to create it for us. And this is where I get into trouble and where I'm always being frustrated. But I'm also really building my own conviction every time I hit this wall, which is, I can't say like what because I am in the goddamn metaverse with you. I am inside your headset with you, okay? I am in the matrix with you. Anything I tell you is going to relate to how we communicate in the matrix, which is in generalities and in non-specific acts, because that's the only ones that we can all talk about at an equal level. Because they're not happening to us. If they're happening to us, then we have a privileged relationship to it. But that privileged relationship doesn't allow for debate, which is the formation, which is the motivation, the structure, rather, of all political engagement. It's just something happens, and then you argue about what should be done or what happened and how much it aligns with right. Right is an abstract term, in a totally idealized moral terms, because that's the only terms that we can talk to in the fucking matrix, inside the metaverse. Now, that doesn't mean we aren't acting. We're acting every day, but we're acting sort of in a sort of a daze, in a trance, acting out the actions that this mapping has laid down for us. But what lets us stay in what lets us stay in the helmet is comfort. Like, yes, I said, screaming misery that is making us all just every day makes all of us feel like it's harder and harder to imagine like a long-term sustaining of these conditions, right? You're just like, how can it feels so much worse. But the thing is, the worse it feels in terms of emotion, the more you're driven to soothe that anxiety the way it was produced, by trying to craft a relationship with politics that is pseudo-active, but is actually totally passive. But that's still totally, I mean, it's still you sitting in a room, right? It's still you looking at a machine. It's still you breathing air. It's still you going to the bathroom. It's still you eating. It's still you having to not be on the internet because you got to go to work. Here it is going on the internet when you're at work. It's it's having a drink with the friends, going to Dave & Buster's, talking to your coworkers about your conditions. That's all stuff you're also doing. But you're doing it both inside this helmet and also outside of it. And only if you can like look at your actual hands, you know what I mean? Instead of the big fake ones that they have inside the shitty looking fucking metaverse, you can't know what's really in front of you. There might be a hand to hold. There might be someone grasping towards yours that you couldn't see otherwise. And that is a cop-out, because I'm not unplugged. I mean, I am, but I can't communicate my time when I'm unplugged onto this here place, onto this. I can't upload it. It gets turned through instant translation to everybody else as like all of the Wittgensteinian miscommunications just explode through the system. I can't relate to anything other than at these abstract points. So that means that my political content cannot, at the end of the day, count in any conscious sense as political. Even though people engage with it in part to get their political rocks off, as it were. And that's a contradiction that I just have to live at the point of for now, because I am in the condition where I do feel comfortable enough that I am able to soothe the general angst, that flows through us all every day. I can regulate it right now, which means I don't feel a need to like punch out of my conditions, as it were. But that doesn't mean I won't, is the thing. That's the neuroses of the neutered bug man, is the terror that when the time comes, you'll make the wrong choice. And you will become a husk. And I think that really does drive liberal anxiety about Trump taking over and becoming a dictator. Because if you really take seriously ideas like if you really take global warming seriously, just get rid of everything else. You want to talk to people on their own level. These people, these liberals, they will, as all liberals must, including conservative ones, they must ground their premises, not in the supernatural, but in an empirical understanding of the world around them, right? They have to understand the world that way to understand everything that flows from that. And that means that they have a faith in the Western scientific imperial tradition, because that's how we publicly deliberate these things that animate our politics and our theology and our social lives and our understandings of economic relationships. So that means that they accept that global warming is real, accelerating, caused by human activity, and must cause almost instantaneous overnight shift in the undergirding, not just material in the form of our societies are powered by carbon, but even our political and social structures, because the petrodollar, it's energy dollars that actually represent the real economic activity of the global system. That's the real blood in the veins. The veins are like the finance structure. The veins are all, the capillaries are all those securities and treasury bonds and like credit or currency exchanges, like all of those derivatives, all those financial transactions come off of this real economy, of this sludge getting pulled out of the ground and then being moved through capitalists' vesicle structure. So how the hell do you get rid of that? You have to have radical politics, because this structure won't do it. Joe Biden winning against Trump won't do it. Joe Biden winning against Trump is going to be part of the same process that has led us to this accelerating beyond intervention feedback loop. So to say, oh no, we need to keep Trump from losing. We need to defend the Democrats, and we need to defend democracy because that'll be better than this fascist takeover. But since we've established empirically that we cannot get rid of our social relations and our political structures outside of a revolutionary situation in time to turn the boat around, we know that, and we're not going to get that from the politics we have now, from the Brandons of the world. So you're saying we're defending that. That is the thing that leads to medium-term annihilation of everything. Now, I guess the argument is Trump taking over as Führer accelerates destruction, and isn't that more immoral? But what that fails to take account of is that if this actually happened, and by the way, this is the reason I don't think it ever will, and I think it's going to stay a liberal fantasy that they use to soothe themselves, that to suck on the thumb sucker, their little pacifier, is the threat of Trump taking over and obliterating democracy. It's the thing they're most terrified of. If that actually happened, then there would be this veil, this ideological veil broken. This spell, this degree of adherence to American institutions would be broken for millions of Americans under conditions of accelerating economic collapse. This is what we have to remember. Things are going to keep getting worse. And, diseases and everything. That is the undercurrent reality here. That is what's eating away at the foundation. Well, hell, maybe they're going to have to act. Shit, people are going to have to do something. And what the liberal might not want that happen because they might fear of losing and they might fear of all the pain that's going to get caused unnecessarily. That's true. But they would not be so terrified of it that it overawed all their other considerations and made them, because here's the thing about these people. That terror makes them do the math to say, okay, I've thought about it, and the most moral and ethical and politically effective thing I can do right now is keep talking about fascism on the internet. Keep warning people about Trump taking power on the internet. I have determined that that's the most effective use of my time. That is the problem with that reasoning, because it gets to that result. Because if you're talking about a presidential election, this is a giant fucking ocean liner. This is the Ever Given. You're not turning it through individual action, you're turning it through collective action. Well, that means getting the ideas out there among the influencers so that they'll tell their people, and they'll tell their people, and they'll tell three friends, and they'll tell four friends, and then what do you know? We've staved democracy. But if the thing broke, if Trump said, okay, I'm taking power, holy shit, people have to act. That's an opportunity. It's not something to be sought or worked towards, because that's the ethical question that's separate from the more general moral questions. The ethical question of how do you go about this stuff, and bringing it about involves hurting people. So that's morally wrong, and don't do that. Like, you don't have to worry. You don't have to say, oh no, this is accelerationism. It's like, no, because you can say this is the only opportunity there is for real movement on the political level. Like people acting in concert against conditions rather than letting them overwhelm them and push them around the way we've been having, which is summarized by the fact that the only populist anti-establishment movement with any real danger to taking power is a reactionary populist one, because of the weakness of the working class movement. So anyway, you should not seek this to happen, but you should recognize that it's not the end of the world. It's not doom. Oh, this is over. It's not, you know what it isn't? It's not the fucking comet hitting Earth and obliterating it like in Don't Look Up. It's not that. you're still there, and you still have to make decisions. And the reason the liberal fears the Trump imperium more than anything, and lets it determine their politics and their actions in life and their identity and their jouissance centerings and where they put their orgone. Like their orgone distribution heuristic here is based on a fear that when the time comes, they will freeze like rabbits. When the time comes, they will fail in the moment, and that means that they will be destroyed. Because if you're fighting for something and you fall in battle, that's Valhalla. I'm sorry, you know. Like, I know that's crude, but like Hegel said that like any life that ends without purpose, like, you know, you're not moving towards a goal in the course of which you die, is like a cup of water being spilled on the floor. And like this is the romantic like mass cultural emotional matrix that like people are terrified of because they associate it with fascism, but it is below fascism. It comes before fascism, and it also powers socialist politics and class politics. So like they want Trump to come and destroy the whole thing, because what they fear is that it won't. If there is still stuff to do, they will take the coward's way out, and that means when they do die, many years later, lying in your bed, you'll ask yourself if you could give it all for one chance, just one chance for freedom. Like they're all afraid they're gonna be the ones who go home and die in their beds, and they're right. They are, because they're soft little marshmallows. We collectively, I'm not talking about Americans, my God, America is a horrible country that does awful things to people and just brutalizes them. But when I say we, I mean the broader audience of people in the sound of my voice. We all know who I'm talking about. It is a consumer subset of Americans. We, who sit and talk about politics in our online salon, like flaneurs of Third Empire France, or the coffee shop lads of 16th century London. We're all soft, but that means that the political right is also soft. They move through life, and the reason that they heighten every conflict into violence is because there is no one calling their bluff. And the fact is that there is a bluff to be called, because these are soft little pillow puffs, and they want to fight, but do they want to die? No, they do not want to die, or they don't want to suffer material decline. They don't want any of that. The danger to American democracy, as we can laughingly call it, as in its institutional extinguishment, as opposed to like getting rid of whatever animating fundamental thing which was gone long ago, if it ever existed, which is, we could argue about the origin of the American Revolution, and I think it's an interesting one, but either way, that light has been extinguished long ago. So anyway, let's get ourselves to the final two chapters of Panditch and Grandin's Making of Global Capitalism, where we talk about once the new millennium, the last 20 years, because the end of the 90s is like when the bow is tied on global capitalism, and it is a thing, it's a contained system, it is a normalized structure, and now it starts running, and immediately fucking seizes up. Immediately. Within a decade of being brought into being, it seizes up. And it has a catastrophic crisis within it that is as violent to it as the Great Depression was. But now, because you have complex, a complex bureaucratic state structure, the United States empire, and legal system, and actual physical like technology, you can respond to that in a way that's much more aggressive and that slows down its worst conflicts, but still distributes a hell of a lot of pain through this system. And so these last two chapters talk about, it's two chapters. One, the first instantiation, those 2 Bush years, those 2 Bush terms, of capitalism really coming into its own, especially with China coming into the world market. And then the last chapter is the response to just the catastrophe of 2008, ends around time of Obama's re-election. So let's talk about it, and then kind of speculate on where they think, what they would think of the last decade, because man, it feels like things are moving much very fast, and like a lot of the central premises of the book, I think, have been like seriously challenged now because of how fastly the political destabilization has that now is powering politics, or powering the global system, has exploded. Because during the Great Depression, the crisis brought about conflict between capitalist states. And they point out in the book that in the new crisis economy, that the conflict is within states, but between class formations within states, and like more like through factions in each state of capital, more broadly. And they leave it there, but like we've seen just in the last 10 years since the book came out, this mass explosion of internal state conflict that has now led a lot of people who are theoretically sober observers of the world around them to conclude that it's closing time for our system of governance. And you know what? I think that it's wishful thinking, because as I said, they long for that annihilation. I think that it's more likely to maintain as this light in the distance to keep people kind of fixed like deer in the headlights. But we'll see either way, and I'm not putting money on any of those odds because I am done predicting things. The idea should be to get as far away from the speculative as possible in politics. And thinking about the future, guessing about the future, that's literally scrying entrails. I mean, it's a flight. Could you get a more vivid example of the flight from reality that like projecting about politics does? Like, look what happened with Nate Silver. He gave politically engaged people an excuse to give a shit about who was up 4 points in the Marist poll 3 months before a presidential election, that they had about 1.000% a fraction of a percent to do with, that they were totally extraneous from, that would have happened the same whether they lived or died. Think about that. Think about the way we think about elections. We're fucking following the shit like it's a race we have money on, when in reality it is a thing that we have no actual control over. But we don't act like that. We don't bet money on it. Some of us do now, as we've needed to chase the monkey and all that, and heighten the stakes because the old stuff is running out of its potency. But mostly we just get our energy from helping the side, and which literally means just fantasizing about future elections and what the results are going to be. Closing your eyes and flying into the ether. It's an escape from reality. And it's the only, but it's also like a part and parcel of caring about politics as a spectator of politics. Like, if that stuff doesn't matter, then we're back to the point where, oh no, like this relationship I had to media that was providing me with one set of satisfactions is actually providing me with something else, which is something that's draining me of actual health. Like we're taking hit points by engaging with it. It's carcinogenic. And then trying to figure out how to decarcinogize our media diet. And that doesn't have to be anyone's goal in life or like single purpose. It can just be something that's in the back of your head that you think about once in a while. It's my job, right, Because, hey, I have a stable relationship with capitalism. I am in a truce with capitalism right now because it's doing good by me right now. That's a thing I cannot ignore. So that means, okay, what am I doing for that money? This is what I'm doing. So what do I have to fill that with? This is what I'm going to fill it with. And at every stage I have to rationalize, which we all do. I'm just saying that when that crack comes, when everybody gets fed up, it's not going to be collective. This is another liberal fantasy that leftists share, is that it will be an aha moment when everybody gets up and does the same thing. Can't happen. Can't happen. Everybody can have the same emotional response, but then they all live in completely different and mostly fractured, isolated, and atomized social relationships where their feelings cannot be translated into action in the same direction. And you can't have that aha action outside of a catastrophe where it's people, if I stay in this house, I'm going to die. Like literally that. If I stay where I am, I'm going to die. Well, then that question is answered. And then you have to go out there and you have to meet the world. And you meet it on its own terms. The hope, though, is that you can get to a point where you can get out of the house and go do something because of a feeling and have your action resonate. But that's because you're going to have an individual relationship where the thing breaks. You're going to have an individual time when something can no longer be sustained. And then you're going to have to act from it. And that means that the place where you're going to get a lot of people having the same thing at the same time is, say, a workplace. Whereas a common condition of immiseration that can cause a sort of common emotional response to it that can be translated into action because of the fact that it is this simultaneous act, this aha or chain reaction that can be sustained. I think that's more accurate. It's more like you only get one or two first, like popping bubble wrap, but every pop bubble can pop someone else's bubble. There is hope, it is there. And yeah, like now I just found out that the Rhine River is like a foot away from being too shallow to navigate. And it is one of the chief arteries of like European consumer goods traffic. This is basically like the fucking Ever Given in the canal, but like permanently. So we're entering a new phase of crisis, of contradictions accumulating. And that's going to have effects on all of us that we have to only be in the mind to receive. So once again, that's all with the disclaimer that this is me, justifying my position. And it's up to you as the person listening to it to take it and either dismiss it or accept it based on how it resonates to you and whether it sounds true. Here I stand, I can do no other. Okay, so let's get to the damn book already. So we've got, this is Section 6, Global Capitalist Millennium. And this is Chapter 11. Ha! Very fitting. Although it should be the next one when the crisis happens. It should be Chapter 11, but whatever. They got close. Chapter 11, World After Its Own Image, which is what Marx in the manifesto says capitalism does. It creates a world after its own image. An endless hall of mirrors. And you can see its expression in culture and the final dissolving of popular culture into social media, that is in fact true at every level. That's one of those Marxist insights that can be attached to a cross-section of like the entire superstructural relationship. Like every level, it's there. Every level, it's applicable along the same reasoning axis. This is why Marxism is so great. This is why it's an unbeatable heuristic for grasping the history of humanity. Because I do think it is a historical discipline, equally as deeply as it is a philosophical or economical one. It's Will Smith's Capital Millennium. I fucked it up. How did I fuck that up? I'm such an idiot. I'm really dumb. I said all that shit, and then I just fucking realized I biffed the hell out of the naming this thing. Maybe, all right, you know what I'll say? It's ironic. Okay. So chapter 11, Life, World After Its Own Image, we get the 90s, right up to the crisis. So like the long 90s that go from 89 to 2001, basically. That the last decade. So what defines this period is a huge titanic shift within world manufacturing, the creation of a new global division of labor, not within a countries, but between countries, where certain types of labor is done in a low-income periphery, and other types of labor is done in the core, the imperial core, and that's what defines this new system, and one of the contradictions that's currently pulling it apart. So what capital is able to do, largely through the leverage that American capital has through its institutions, the IMF and the World Trade Organization, when these crises emerge. Capitalism is imposed in these places, it creates crises, and then capitalism itself is able to use those conditions to further entrench itself and extend its rule, even though it's responsible for the fucking crisis. You can't beat it, man. You can't beat it. It's goddamn near everything. It's a perfect killing machine. It's like oh fuck, what's his name? Ian Holm in Alien said, "I admire its purity." It's the perfect machine to take over all human minds and wills. It's a fucking it's a living god. It's an evil god. It's the devil, Lucifer, whatever you want to call it. It is a alienated technology that reflects humanity's worst traits back at it as virtues. That's what it does. And so that makes everyone act, consciously, unconsciously, through coercion or consensus, in a psychotic, self-destructive way, like socially destructive. And what we've had until these decades was other systems of existence that generated other outcomes that were orthogonal to capitalism, that could contest with capitalism for control of resources. But that's gone. This period is when it is all gone, because it is these IMF loans extract reforms in these countries that create what they call institutional architecture, which is a commonality of institutions of regulation that promote things like best practices for accounting and bank regulations, the entire structure of state oversight that like capital markets have to work around. Like it's the armature that like it has to work with. They cannot be extracted. So those rules are unified, and they are unified along an American model. Anglo-American jurisprudence, good old common law, and the primacy of property determine these reforms. And another organization that helps extend this is the G20, which starts off as the G22, and then they start the process up, and then there's a later meeting where some countries get kicked out of the G22, including Malaysia, which after the Asian crisis refused to get rid of their capital controls. They got the boot out of there for violating their economic orthodoxy. And this sets up a model for austerity in the periphery, where these countries have to restructure their social spending. And they have to reduce basically not just labor share of income, but also its access to public goods. Like it has to shrink working class life experience. It has to curtail living standards. That's the word I'm looking for. And then, but in the center, stimulus. In the center, money, mostly at the top, but there is a trickle-down effect. That's not made up, but largely through credit. not even so much through people like, creating a real economy, but by the financialization of debt, the creation of this economy of credit card and mortgage-backed loans that allows people to purchase. And it varies from country to country. America is obviously the most consumer-based because we're the consumer country. We're the country that, through its organs of global capitalism, imposed a value system of indulgence, personal pleasure, above anything. Ease and convenience as the sum of human happiness. That is what America imposed on the world, that the sum of human happiness is a hedonic pleasure, but not in, of course, the traditional sense of hedonic, where, the notion that you're doing what feels good, but what feels good is also what is good. But living in capitalism, where you're fully alienated, where you're looking through the glass, darn it, it's only associated now with feeling with what's bad for other people, what's bad for you. So that pleasure comes at an expense, and that expense is this psychic angst, this scream that has to be suppressed and redirected elsewhere with pathological action. So that means the main thing we do in the United States is, we're not going to raise your living standards. We are not going to let your next generation of family keep your home. We're going to split up your homestead, basically. But you're going to be able to access more short-term pleasure than you know what to do with. You have absolute freedom to indulge yourself. And again, this is not anyone's fault that they took this deal. It doesn't make Americans scumbags who are fat and love burger or whatever. It's the only deal that was on the table. The class system, the class project that stood within it and opposed to this thing has been destroyed. Babylon has risen. Leviathan fucking smiles, as Al Swearingen said. And of course, it has not been universally adapted. Not all cultures feel that way, but it's the model that these structures that are imposed are imposing, and they're changing the structures from the top, from the global center to the periphery. They're changing social structures, and this is the nut of the internal conflict between grounded, landed capitalism and finance capitalism that marks politics in the advanced countries, because the treats are running out, right? The ability to access short-term pleasure has been curtailed, so people are feeling more alienated from politics, more willing to work outside of its structures. And where does that energy go? It goes to the right mostly, because the Democratic Party and the labor parties of Europe no longer advance a class agenda. They can't. So that energy just floats uncaptured, whereas the right has structures to capture it with its non-class-based critique, with its identity critique of American, however you want to conceive of that. And this is why the National Socialist Project is a dead end, because they will always tail the fascist middle class, always. They can only tail the fascist middle class because they're acting together in a class interest that is in an ambiguous relationship to capitalism, where there's still treats to be had extracted from capitalism, as opposed to the worker who is incapable of accessing that. So even though you might have workers who are stirred to the cause of socialism through the lens of these like nationalist concepts that are like, reproduced in hierarchical notions of gender and race and all this stuff, you will only be able to act as a bunch of individual nationalists. Your working interest will be diluted by the collective and overwhelming interest of the numerically larger and positionally more dominant middle class. Small bourgeois, when I say middle class now. Small bourgeois, holders of capital. They'll bash you to death. So the entire post-left project is fundamentally doomed because the math does not work. You got X number of middle-class people aligned on a propertarian defense of hierarchy. That's what they want. That's what their motive is. It is a self-interested, self-aware, when they become nationalists, self-aware hierarchy. Godly, divine, however you want to call, whatever you want to call God. Their dominance within the political structure will dwarf your workers' contribution. The fucking Iranian Revolution is proof of this. The reactionary heartlands, and it was a middle. The Ayatollah's social base, by the way, were landowners who were reacting to not just the authoritarianism of the Shah, but to his process of land redistribution, which he was forced to do, by the way, by Carter, who wanted to do some like Kennedy-style shit, where it's like, oh, let's stop squeezing the peasants of Iran. And in so doing, in redistributing land, he awoke this sleeping dragon of religious Orthodox Shia resistance. And the Marxist kids in the cities also hated the Shah, but for different reasons. And they worked together to overthrow them. And then once the revolution had been won, the left was neutralized. Physically, politically, wiped off the map. Thousands fucking hung from cranes. Okay, so let's get back to this damn book. So the crisis that emerges in the 90s, the U.S.-led order is able to use to create a environment of equal protection within each country for their domestic banks and foreign banks, domestic investors and foreign investors. So there's an equal playing field, which of course is not an equal playing field because of the huge symmetry in power and in capital holdings that these two countries are engaged with, which means that an equal playing field favors, in every instance, to a determining factor, Western countries. Like, this is what makes this an imperial domination, basically, is this fake equality. This is liberalism at its finest, a fake formal equality that actually perpetuates domination. Here, the domination of the West, headquartered in the United States, to the periphery, because now you guys have equal treatment, which favors larger concentrations of capital. But what this causes is this huge explosion of money swashing through the system, which is why all the individual bourgeois and governing figures in these countries all signed off on this. They didn't really have to have their fucking arms pulled. Like, a few of them had to get killed, like Allende or whatever, but for the most part, they were happy to do it. Twist my arm, because they were representing national bourgeois who wanted access to those funds, who didn't really give a shit about their countrymen, who dominated and exploited them. So you have this huge explosion in financial flows and in loans and security purchases, stocks, bonds, like swishing around the world, money being borrowed, money being invested. You go from $1 trillion in 1990 in foreign financial movement in a year to 11 trillion by 2007. From 1 to 11 from 1990 to 2007. That was like a whole dam. That's all derivatives. You have, by 2007, there is a $5 trillion a day turnover in financial contracts. Currency is being swapped, bonds are being purchased, stocks are flowing at a rate of $5 trillion a day. So this is, but this is all on top of the real economy. And these guys take pains at one point to say, and I'll talk about it in another chapter, that you can't really say that it's not the real economy, because it's essentially, the blood vessels, as I said, and like it moves everything through it. So it is the real economy, but it is the real economy in crisis. It's the real economy no longer able to output what it used to because of differing inputs, because capitalism is literally draining the earth, and the rate of profit is declining even faster, which means that the mad need to eat out all of the structural innards that allow this thing to progress. The states, like the United States, that actually allow this thing to continue has come to a fatal point. This is a contradiction that cannot be internally resolved, and it is critical. And this differs only from previous crises at the end of a system of class rule, only in it's global. Like, this has happened a million times before. All this has happened before. All this will happen again. As they say on Battlestar Galactica, capitalism is just the latest in a series of engines, social engines for a class rule, vehicles for a certain class rule, a collection of people which has been remarkably stable throughout all of human history. And all of them come to a fatal crisis and collapse from within. The only difference now is that this is within a closed global system. So what does collapse in that context mean? And that is what we're terrified of. Because we think it means the ends of everything, because we cannot imagine life in any other way. Capital realism, ding, ding, ding. But of course, that doesn't mean life won't continue. And we will not have to necessarily step through the gate bravely to encounter the moment of truth. It will be thrust upon us, and we will act as humans. And if you have faith in your own humanity, then you should have an equal amount of faith in others. And so that means you should have some sense of stillness to face this crisis with. I get a lot of people hate themselves and therefore hate everybody else, but that's really just an indulgent self-love and a desire to basically pamper yourself into oblivion. Like, you can just keep swaddling yourself in pleasures that you disguise as masochistic pain, but are in fact actually deeply pleasurable. The agonies of political pretension. And of course, self-destructive use of drugs or alcohol or food or whatever. So by 2008, you've got foreign bank loans to developing countries in the neighborhoods of $1.5 trillion in Asian countries, $900 billion in Eastern Europe, the former communist bloc, and $800 billion in Latin America. Significantly less in Africa. Africa never really did get developed before capitalism started to its crisis. Like, that is the difference between Africa and everywhere else, really, is that it was the last in line to get capitalized when the input system, the undergirding material economics of the thing, broke. When entropy of a certain degree entered the system, profits began their inexorable downward trajectory, absent intervention in the form of neoliberalism, retrenchment, and the undevelopment of Africa. Money that would have gone to develop Africa profitably, but slowly in the post-war model, instead had to get maximum profits in minimum time, which means hyper-exploitation at the point of a gun. Like, primitive accumulation is still alive and well at the end of the capitalist chain of development, because it never sustained a equilibrium for long enough to distribute to Africa, nor could it have, because it was never able to was never able to make its calculations. No human within it, the thing itself, could not make its calculations with a real understanding of how many resources it had access to, because the resources are where the real pain is happening, and that pain has to be invisible. It cannot be calculated in the system, so it cannot be absorbed, it cannot be perceived. But that pain, plants, animals, species dying, disequilibrium being entered into, the pain matrix of sustainable ecosystems, that cannot be calculated. So you'll never know until it's too late when you hit it. And that's what we've done. Every society, every civilization has hit it because its ruling class is committed to living in the bubble where their domination is justified, and they'll never leave. They can only fall from the top or be pushed. But of course, the money, it's all tidal gravity, as Ned Beatty said. So yes, all this money goes to Asia, but then and Eastern Europe and Latin America, but it also has to come back to the United States in the form of U.S. Treasury bonds purchased to fill the reserves of countries that just saw all those Asian economies destroyed by currency runs. Well, they can't run on your currency if you've got a bunch of U.S. dollars sitting in reserve. If you have dollar-denominated assets under state control, you cannot be run out on because their capital, because you will still be able to back your currency with that, as opposed to backing with the credit that they were floating you, which is basically how financing economies works. It used to be gold, now it's treasury bills. The closest thing, because the American state is it is the keystone. It needs to fucking be stable, so therefore we all assume its stability eternally, religiously, because it is the first thing. It's the first mover. It's the defining. It's the God, basically. And if it dies, then everything dies, because you can't conceive of anything else. You can't conceive of change because we've all been bewitched, bedazzled, hoodwinked, run amok, hornswoggled even. So there's investment in these countries, but governments are also buying treasuries, so that they have these reserves, so that their economies cannot. So they'll have some control over their issuance of currency. But here's the problem with this. Like, you can say, this is noble. All right, get these reserves, buy these treasuries, protect your currency. But another condition of this state of affairs is that exports in these countries have to wildly exceed imports. They cannot have their dollars going out of the country buying shit so that it can get turned into dollars in America. So that means that there has to be an explicit policy of limiting working class incomes. Because the more money the working class of these countries have, the more they're going to spend it on stuff from other countries, because these countries did not develop internal, they were not able to do import substitution economics for long enough, because remember, it got destroyed by the Volcker shock. They did not hold on, they could not develop those like high-tech, high-end industries that give the kind of consumer products that people are going to buy if they have money now, and they're going to make them feel like they have control of their lives, all the stuff that we've all been rewired with, all the Mad Men shit, all the Pavlovian zombification that everybody is exposed to. The stuff they're going to buy is not made in that country, which means there go those dollars, or there goes those reserves. You're once again vulnerable to a bank run. So they built low-cost, low-capital investment manufacturing, and that became the basis for their economy. They stopped the old way that peripheral countries worked related to the United States was they would provide cheap exports in the form of agriculture and natural resources. Now they would provide labor that used to get done in the center would move to the periphery, so that those former people who couldn't get college degrees, who used to work in factories together and therefore be in unions together, that could work to elect political candidates, that could push their agendas and their economic self-interest, gone. So they get to what? They get to die, is what they get. The hope is that they die. They are falling into the cauldron of the proletariat, the real proletarianized American subject, which is finally emerging on the stage of history. And it's causing middle-class hysteria because they all are terrified of falling in, or their kids falling in. Because for a while it was, if you have a college degree, you didn't have to worry about that. And that's why the political system was stabilized, because college-educated people, that's a lot of them by that point, because the U.S. was handing out those degrees like Pez after World War II. So that means there's plenty of people who sent their kids to college, who have a home that they got with a GI Bill, who are like, all right, this is still good. Everybody who got fucked ended up becoming apolitical, working more hours for less money at other jobs, dealing with all the social pathologies that come with that, dealing with drug abuse, crime, all the things of poverty, which is the inevitable trajectory of everybody who has no more access to upward mobility, in an ever widening gyre of exploitation, there's nowhere else to go. And that is why I understand why people get conspiratorial about fucking oxy and fentanyl. Because you've got this now efflorescence of downwardly mobile Americans who used to be and whose families are still connected to, the middle class patrimony, just left adrift. What if they got political? What if even if they didn't get political, what if they just stayed antisocial? That means conflict with the law. That means conflict with the state. That means repression. That means having to fucking put them in jail, having to pay for them to be in jail, having to put money that should be going to profits into this. Good news is profit can be made off of it, but it's still not where we'd rather put it. When we could just, what's this? Have them all kill themselves. The same thing, the same asphyxiation strategy and a drug-abated asphyxiation strategy that was applied to the black inner cities in the 70s and 80s. Just advanced up the chain of crisis, the declining profit crisis that we've been in during the same time. Put some of them in jail, the rest hopefully kill themselves. I only recently found this out, but more people were killed in the 1980s gang wars between the Bloods and the Crips than were killed during the Troubles in Northern Ireland during that same period of time. And it was essentially the same phenomenon in both cities. It was a group of working class, socially alienated, as in like not part of the dominant, because these are advanced capitalist countries, they have a notion of like middle class existence, propriety. They're outside of that ethnically, but they're also, until the 70s, they have access to some conception of upward advancement. And you see that in the building of like real wealth in black communities up until the 60s and 70s. It's that wealth that launched really the civil rights movement, in the sense that it was the workers, it was people who had experience mobilizing and acting as workers within the black community who formed the real spine of the civil rights movement. One of the chief organizers of the Montgomery bus boycott was a member of A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Otis Nixon, I believe his name was. But by the 70s, those structures are gone, and soon the economic base that allowed it to exist, the factory jobs, are gone, leaving these people. What are they to do? There are fewer jobs available. They're more immiserating physically. They're lower paying. But there's this shadow economy that you can participate in. Now, in Northern Ireland, it's political because of the specific historical relationship between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, how it created like the first racial caste system, really. Like the English basically practiced on the Irish what they eventually imposed on Africans. That's not to say that they had it worse. It's just that they were essentially the imperial laboratory. And because of that, the violence that emerges from these guys who have no jobs to go to but are still young, vital men and have access to guns and can organize, it moves in a political direction. And of course, it ends up engaging with this class fratricidal war against the totally ideologically propagandized and essentially brainwashed working class Protestants who face the same downward trajectory but are not alienated from the state the same way, but who now have this enemy to fight. And it gives everybody a thing to do. And it kills thousands of people, and they nearly blow up Queen Elizabeth. They nearly blow up Margaret Thatcher. And there's a huge global story. And it involves mix across the country sending money to the Northern Irish Relief Fund, which goes to buy Armalites and shit. Meanwhile, in America, where the black political project has been destroyed, and literally destroyed by the state in the form of COINTELPRO sabotage. The gang war is impossible to understand outside of the context of the state destruction of the political arm of urban black proletarians. And with that destruction, there's only survival in the form of making money in the black market and organizing to do so, which of course creates, territorial conflict, and you get the same venting, basically, of violence, and at an even higher level. And meanwhile, those fat micks sitting on bar stools in fucking Summerbury or whatever the fuck, they're looking on the TV at the Rodney King riots and going, shoot them, get the guns, because of the veil of racial mysticism that is over everybody's face. So this new global, but this is key, this new global division of labor, it accumulates low-skill manufacturing in the periphery, but high-skill administration and engineering stuff in the center. And the stuff in the center is like tightly controlled by the company itself, is like a key element of like the company, a direct expenditure. Whereas the people actually doing the manufacturing in these countries are often independent suppliers who aren't even formally part of the ownership portfolio of the company. And this, perpetuates and can only perpetuate a widening of a global, a widening of the gap between these two countries, and a direct transfer of wealth from one to the other. When you make an iPhone, so there's half the cost of an iPhone is slapped on by Apple on top of the actual costs to make it in Asia. There's like 62 factories in different countries that make different parts of it that are then brought to China for final assembly. Only like 1% of an iPhone is actually made in China, apparently. And then sent to the U.S. But the U.S.'s profit premium that they slap on is all to go to domestic costs like engineering, like marketing. So a disproportionate percentage of the money from the making of an iPhone stays in the U.S. and doesn't go to these countries. And of course, doesn't go to their workers. So yes, so the middle class is the working class who could get to the middle class, the working middle class. They're a dying institution. They're gonna die out, and their kids are gonna die young, basically. And they know it, and there's nothing they can do about it. Some of it is political, most of it is just despair. But of course, all of it politically mostly goes to the right because they have a coherent, violent relationship, violent alienation to the state that can't be matched on the left. Institutionally, sure, there are left, like George Floyd protests showed it. People want to fight the state, but there are no structures to hold that interest. The Democratic Party spent 2020 saying, no, thank you. We have nothing. We do not want this. Of course, there's all these idiots who say, the Democrats did the fucking riots and they wanted it to happen. They were terrified and they wanted to disassociate themselves from it immediately because their fundamental remit is to prevent that from happening. It's part of the structure, the DNA of the Democratic Party. It can't do anything but that. So that means there is no left-wing container for downwardly mobile, white, middle-class precarity, misery, alienation. There's no container for it currently. Doesn't mean there won't still always be one. But right now there isn't one. It's all going to get contained by the right. But somebody's kids are going to have still have an opportunity. If there wasn't, then who's going to vote for these candidates? Who's going to pretend democracy still exists? And that is that percentage of the people with houses whose kids went to college. And they were working class, they were small business owners, they were professional managers, maybe even. All they have in common is they own houses and they send their kids to college. Millions and millions of them. And the promise now is manufacturing jobs are gone. They're gone to places where people make very much less money. But here you can make a decent salary, get your own house, working in the high-tech industries, in the business services economy, and servicing those things, educating people in those. But you need to go to college for this. You need to perform the rituals of compliance to the mores of the ruling class. You have to learn, basically, how to raise your pinky when you drink tea, because you're basically going to go into a big fancy dinner party. And that is what college is for. Because you can't have everybody rushing up into the middle classes. You have to screen. The way you screen is making hoops for people to jump. And the more hoops they're willing to jump is related to the more they are psychically and personally suborned to the American capitalist state, right? Like, you're not going to work hard to do good in school so you can get to the top and get these jobs doing this stuff if you don't have a belief in what you're doing. That belief in what you're doing has to connect to a belief that the system it's embedded in. At a certain point, if you lose faith in the systems that it's embedded in, you lose motivation to keep jumping through hoops. So that means the people who get out on the other side are going to be, some of them are going to be working class people who are so traumatized by poverty and precarity that they are now psychically driven like fucking hamsters to just run away from it as fast as possible and are going to use any means to do so. But mostly it's going to be people who grow up pretty comfortably and who want to keep living comfortably and maybe even more comfortably, and who have a pride and an ability, a mental ability of some kind that they can perform, that they can carry out and be remunerated for. They don't have to do with their brain what they don't want. They can take the stuff they like thinking about and the stuff they like acting on and turn it into a job. That's the dream of college. Not one for one. You got to be within a limit, but you get some choice. Because if you don't have a choice, if you take the job that you have to take, you've lost your mind to the job. And you will spend every moment at that job alienated to a degree that somebody who does not feel that degree of compulsion won't feel. But there is this opportunity, and millions of people flowed into it, from the people whose parents worked on factory lines, people whose parents were dentists. They all did it, and they made this new cadre, and it was still a track up until the point where the balloon knot puts on. But not just in things like the academy or entertainment or engineering or tech or anything. You also have the financialized economy creating a new category of bureaucrats, people who with like specific skill sets can apply their minds to. And this is as an economy is completely financialized. These companies, the ones that still manufacture things, are also financializing their profits. They're borrowing tons of money because of low interest rates. They're investing the pensions of their employees in different funds. They're buying stock back. And the way that Pandin describes this is, they say, many people think of the 90s as the hollowing out of American manufacturing, but it's actually the restructuring of American manufacturing. Now, of course, that means whole entire communities died on the vine. But of course, within the greater context of the American economy, moving that capital to the big cities to create knowledge centers that produce even more profits, that's a net win. It's only a loss for those people in those towns. And they don't really have a voice. Their alienation and pain is now added to the chorus of the trees that got cut down to build their fucking houses, and the animals that got hunted to extinction, and the plants that got fucking defoliated. That was all happening, and it was invisible, and all the misery now being piled up is invisible. So for people work at the who think they're in charge of this thing, they think this is all good. People misunderstand this. We're building a new economy. This is why the Clinton always talked about education. Oh, we're going to retrain all those fucking dumbass miners, and they're going to fucking work in clickety-clap jobs. But everybody can't work the clickety-clap job. The funnel, the limiting process is structural. The bottleneck is necessary for the actual flow of the thing. You can't get rid of it. So a huge amount of buying power is wiped out of non-college educated workers because their kids can't get those jobs. Those jobs gone away. They've got fired. But they're still spending money more than you would think given how less money they have. And their suburban counterparts whose incomes are flat, even though they're more comfortable, they also keep spending because the gap in is now being filled with credit, consumer credit. Only America can do this because only America can be allowed to do this. Any other country tries to do that kind of thing, they are punished with a run on their currency. But America is the currency, and its stability is necessary to the system stability. So we can do that. Like all the structures we've talked about have allowed the United States to not have to worry about the disciplinary nature of inflation because of its centrality to the system. We pretend otherwise for political reasons, to punish and destroy the working class and lower, and keep them in a condition of abjection relative to capital. But people are still able to get this money from credit, from mortgages, and they spend it. So the consumer spending in the United States is still the engine of the American economy, but it's all now being borrowed, basically from the world. And this created, though, in American commentariat, this mirage, this terror of a trade deficit. So while this is happening, we're building this thing that's monumentally advantageous to American industry. But there's this horror in politics about a trade deficit. And that's because they can't talk about loss of jobs, because that has to happen anyway. Trade deficit is a fake made-up thing. Oh no, we're not trading enough. Because yes, every iPhone that gets sold increases the U.S. trade deficit. But it also is a huge shift of surplus to the U.S. from the rest of the world. And as a result of that, by the end of the crisis, by the beginning of the crisis, at the apogee, at like 2006, profits relative to the U.S. GDP were higher than they've been since 1945. So they have gone back to the super profit days, even before of the post-war economy, and they surpassed them. But by cannibalizing their economies, by destroying the middle-class engine of consumption, the thing that actually made it work, which was the connection to a manufacturing economy, a production and consumption economy. You've created this instead, this pure consumption economy. It's fundamentally unstable. And sure enough, we're going to see in the next chapter, as soon as it's built, it collapses. The last piece, though, to put this thing together, the necessary component to build this thing, is the integration of China into the American system. So China recognizes in the 90s, oh shit, we're going to get squashed if we don't have American dollar reserves. They figure that out, everybody else. That means exports. But because of the size of their economy, they're able to operate from a better bargaining position, basically. I mean, they have nukes, for example. Then all these other countries that kind of got squashed by the crisis. So to deal with this, first in 1994, they devalued their currency, the renminbi, which is a thing you want to do if you want to boost imports because it makes your products more cheaper on the world market, more desirable. And then in 2001, they were admitted into the World Trade Organization. They made a bunch of concessions to regulators to not fully, like they never opened their economy, and they certainly never opened their finance system to reform to the degree the other countries did, because they didn't have to. They had so many people dangling there, like the market was so big and tantalizing, and all that possible labor, they had such leverage that they could insist on maintaining control. But they did significantly liberalize their laws. They equalized their laws the same way that they did in other countries. And they created a bunch of domestic capitalist institutions to try to meet this new wave of American and Western investment, to build these manufactories that are going to be able to increase profits by minimizing labor costs. And the thing that makes this deal even better for the West is that not only are these going to be people from countries that are much poorer, but the people doing the majority of this labor are going to be people with no real rights. Because, the question in China is, okay, we're going to exploit the shit out of our people in order to build capitalism because we have to avoid the fate of the Soviet Union. And, I can't argue with their reasoning. I probably would have thought the same thing if I was in those rooms. But that means breaking the notion of citizen rights and responsibilities, the iron rice bowl of civic of social welfare that had undergirded the industrial economy in the 70s and 80s. We can't just take this from them. That's going to be wildly destabilizing, and it was. Tiananmen Squares were kind of an example of that friction. But what they basically did in China was create an internal army of non-persons. Because in other countries where before this new setup, the ideal worker, and still to this day in the West, the ideal worker is an illegal immigrant because they have no leverage. You can just call the cops on them anytime you want. They have no legal rights, and they have no safety net. Like these Chinese citizens had gotten a safety net. They had rights, they had accesses to public goods. And the more of those you have, the harder it is to be mega exploited. So China creates this system of internal fixedness, where you are essentially like a medieval serf, not allowed legally, technically, to leave the area that you are registered at birth. So if you're born in the deeply poor Western country, farm agriculture country of China, you are required to keep access to rights and emoluments, health care, things like that, education. You have to stay where you're registered. But when they start building these factories in these cities, as they happen everywhere else in the world, the siren call of labor in the city brings, like a fucking magnet pulling filings, brings excess landed or excess landless rural proletarians to it. If you don't have any land, if you can't sustain yourself on the land, and you can only be a hired laborer in a rural area, you have absolutely no potential for any kind of upward advancement in life. There's nothing you can pine for even. You're there. But life in the city promises a degree of upward trajectory that is irresistible, always is. So you have a situation where in 1978, 70% of work of labor in China is agriculture, 30% of it is non. By 2004, it switched, 70% is now non, 30% is agriculture, and that is a huge bunch of people in the rural parts of China moving to these cities where they become internal migrants who have no access to public provision and no real rights to be there. But of course, they're allowed to stay there to collect those low wages in a condition where they can't really organize their own interests. It's pretty ingenious. But again, you can argue, from the Chinese perspective, if you want to keep any kind of idea of human values alive in the system that we have, if you want to keep any dreams of what it is to be Chinese or a member of the global proletariat or whatever the fuck abstract category that you value as a person, the only way to keep that embedded in control of this thing is if we accede to the reality that a global capitalist system can beat people into submission. And when they've been totally destroyed, then they've become abject. And you want to see that? You look at Africa. Population about the size of China's, but never subject to the organizing principle that drove Chinese civilization, and the last reached by the developmental arm of capitalism. So this is somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 million internally migrant Chinese, who are Chinese people, but because no one ever pointed to them and said, you're no longer Chinese, you're no longer a part of our people, you're no longer part of our nation, you're no longer part of our grand project of communism. You just made the criminal decision to leave your neighborhood. And now we don't have to fucking listen to you when you say you're being hyper exploited by your employer. Get back to work. But much more than rights, though, it's about just the fact that they have no recourse, and they have no safety net. The safety net thing is really big, because more than any kind of system of conflict, it's just basic security that makes you willing to stand up for yourself. Absent that, you're just one foot in front of the other. So what this does in China is it lowers poverty hugely. And I've said this before, but anybody who loves to jack off about how capitalism took a bazillion people out of poverty in the 20th century, that's almost all China. That is almost all in a place where capitalism was managed to the greatest degree it was anywhere else, where there was a human hand at the tiller to a greater degree than anywhere else. Everywhere else, you saw stagnation or even decline. But huge rise in inequality. So there's less poverty in China, but there's much more inequality. And as a result of that, there's a dearth of consumption in the Chinese market, which is why they are so dependent on American exports and American consumption, and why they keep buying our fucking bonds and can never stop. They need to keep buying our fucking treasuries. They cannot discipline us or own us epically Mao style. They cannot conduct the Third World War against the capitalist West or any of that bullshit without collapsing their own economy. Because at this point anyway, there's still just too low a degree of consumption per person, which means the U.S. market has to make that up. And so they export a ton of stuff for us to just hoover up like piglets. Like every time I watch Shark Tank and I see some fucking dumb gadget, I just think this is why America is indispensable and why we're not going to get a replacement for the dollar anytime soon. I saw this thing called beard mints on Shark Tank once, and they were tiny little ornaments that you'd hang in your beard. And it got funded, and it ended up being a big success. And I just remember thinking, no one on earth but an American would buy that. And that means then that if you have a factory that needs to be open to make those fucking things, you need Americans to buy them. If you want to keep that factory in Wuhan open, you need some dumbass in America who will pay $15 for something that cost a quarter of a cent to hang on their fucking beards. So this is a situation in the second Bush term. You've got a juicy, fat, huge profit sheets. Everybody's making so much money. It's throbbing. Oh my God, baby, we've never had such a robust, sweet, juicy economy. Corporate profits are through the roof. The balance sheets look great. We're loving it. There's only a little bit of friction. You got the Argentinian crisis, but that's okay. They kind of let them go off and do their own political revolution and default, and they were fine. There's always big crash, it hurts, and then you go, real business cycle kicks in, it's fine. But this is a period of sustained low interest rates because you have the dot-com bubble bursts in 2001, and there's a short recession. that only lasts until November, and is basically ended by the fucking spigot of low interest rates being opened by the Fed. And the real estate market becomes, in this context, the investment of last resort globally. The place to park money. You can buy treasuries, but you can't only buy treasuries. You need something with a higher promise of return. Because if you can borrow at a low interest, if you can put money into something that's got a higher return, you're basically set. You've got a guaranteed pipeline of profit. And what that looked like for a long time was U.S. real estate, because it had been securitized. There had been a bridging of the gap between high finance and low. You've got high finance in the form of giant international banks, and then low finance in the humble home mortgage, which was the most localized and boringest and lowest sort of return, the safest, guaranteed return, but it's not going to be substantial, sort of finance in America. And the securitization of the mortgage connects these and allows these huge houses, huge investors to see profit out of this. And it's by, we all know this story, getting a bunch of fucking mortgages together, chopping them up, selling them into pieces, diluting the risk of any one of them so that the overall risk is relatively low, but you can, and then that means there's more willingness to borrow. And this becomes twistedly the way that guys like Clinton imagine they're going to fix the black home ownership problem. Because we talk about those GIs who got that sweet deal after World War II. African Americans were pointedly redlined out of that deal, and the difference to this day in wealth between the average white and black American is about the cost, at least it used to be, of one home. And in a average market. And of course, the old days of direct provision, that's not happening. Of course, we never built public housing. But instead what we'll do is we'll create these new collateralized mortgage systems that allow for things like adjustable rate mortgages, which are much riskier, higher profit margin and incentive for the lender, and a good deal for the borrower as long as that rate stays low. And then and then finally, this is allowed to happen because of the fact that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, these quasi-government organizations, are backing these transactions and making tons of money off of swapping these things and acting as like a clearinghouse for all these new federally secured mortgages that are on much, much, much flimsier economic basis than previous ones have been. Because you're not giving somebody a 30-year fixed to somebody who's got a factory job. We're now talking about people who are working much more unpredictably, whose income is much more vulnerable, who have more debt. That's a huge part of it. Who have more debt other than a mortgage. And are now just being told, okay, good luck. You can afford X amount, but if it goes up, you're ruined. And of course, many of them weren't told that. So Fannie and Freddie are backing, in the 1980s, they backed 70% of mortgages in America. And by 2007, it's 45%. And so in this context, though, house values just go up because demand is through the roof. And of course, supply is sort of constrained relatively. Like, we stopped building houses in this country in the 70s. If you look at the chart, it's stunning. So house prices in the 2000s go up 60% over inflation, which is the most since the war. And what this means, though, is that there's this new type of instrument that has this highly rated, secure, it's related to the American housing economy, which is related to the American consumer economy, which undergirds the entire thing. This is as a sure thing as buying treasuries is. And that means there's a huge rush of foreign money into the American real estate market because of the interdependence of these systems now. I mean, the money's got to go somewhere. If there's profit to be had here, it will draw money towards it. And there's all this money sitting, piling, that cannot be profitably invested elsewhere because the rate of profit is going down, because the structural inputs have degraded. The eternal footman is at your coat. He's snickering. But of course, the system can't acknowledge that. It just goes into overdrive. Sure, we have to keep eating our seed corn, dissolving all the social bonds that allow this thing to go. Whatever, because there is no alternative. So finally, when the crisis comes, it's not because of any structural problem. It's not because of any crisis in the production process. It's simply that this is a highly speculative economy that is therefore highly volatile. But in such a context, when you have this key component, this key investments, this key input, let's call it that, in the form of like this continued flow of money into this mortgage system. All of these mortgages, all this money goes flowing from people's bank accounts to all these institutions. That capillary action upward from the people buying and swapping and borrowing against homes and all this stuff, all these flows of money plus interest that are going through the system. If it's kinked, the whole thing collapses internationally. One of the big reasons that a lot of people thought that there could never be a crisis that there was in 2008 is because there was a belief, people don't talk about it anymore, but there was a common understanding among economics that there could not be a national housing crisis, that there is no such thing as a national housing market, because markets are determined by conditions in their local area, location, economics in local areas, which shift. You know, I mean, we talk about how the American Middle West was hollowed out by deindustrialization, but the Southwest was built, the Sun Belt. It was not just a destruction somewhere, it was building elsewhere. Of course, built in the least hospitable place where nobody else went before because it wasn't where you go. But of course, that's the only place left, so that's where we gotta go. What's that? We need to fucking have ACs running 24 hours in every fucking home, and we need to have fucking water pumped in from thousands of miles away. We got to create fake aqueducts to steal water from other states. Sure. What could go wrong? It's the only place we can put the money, though, because it can't stay there, because we build it around these structures that are no longer cost effective. We got to build new stuff. And they did. They built Phoenix. Wonderful. Great idea. They destroyed Cleveland and Detroit. Mid-century marvels with some fantastic architecture. And they built glass cubes in the desert. Fantastic. So all you got is a kink in the hose. People stop being able to afford their mortgages. Every one of these people is juggling every day. Something hits, it collapses the entire fucking house. So when this happens, I'm not gonna belabor this too much. They go through like a point-by-point thing of how the Fed and the Treasury responded, but I hope we moan most of this stuff. It all boils down to Fed and the Treasury came in and just gave everybody money, bought everybody's bad debt. It's pretty simple. You got bad debt, we're buying it. Of course, the people who took bad mortgages, they got to get out of the houses. They still have to leave. And this is the original sin of the Obama administration. This is where everything else flows from. The decision to capitalize the borrowers or the lenders and literally dispossess the borrowers. And it's just because we live in a capitalist system. Like, it could be no other way. And like, Obama could have done it technically, but no one who gets to where Barack Obama gets in that year would do it. The system had refined itself to such a way, had created a robust enough network of white blood cells that it could strain out and defeat any other impulse, any other instinct than the subconscious but total submission to capitalism. Now, he might have been forced to do it from the bottom, but of course, that energy had been dissipated. Those structures had become decrepit. So yeah, yes, Obama could have done differently, but it's hard to call it a betrayal because he was always that, we just didn't know. He has a tragic view of history, which means that he has given up the idea that humans can control their own affairs. He is of the same mind metaphysically as all of the billionaire class that he hangs out with, and the unspoken voice of our popular culture in general that dissipates through our machineries of cultural reinforcement. There can be no social life, so we have to build technologies of distance. So the fact, though, that this is a political process that has to go through the political hoops and people have different levels of understanding of what's going on, it means that the response is not instantaneous. The way it was in 2020 when the economy collapsed right at the beginning of COVID, that was an instantaneous infusion. And that's why we didn't get a Great Recession again in 2020, because it was instantaneous. The reason we got the Great Collapse of 2008 is that there was this period when the response had to be gathered, and they had to get votes together and sign legislation and do all this. But there's no legislation in 2020. Oh, what? Some fucking thing that passed immediately without anybody even looking at it? And this is a perfect example of how capitalism works. You have the Great Depression, which is a huge catastrophe, goes on horrifically long, leads to world wars, the death of hundreds of millions. Bad, horrible. If you can prevent it, please do. 2008, we had another huge shock to the global system. And the intervention, it's not fast enough to stop there being a decline in the economy and a suffering, but it does prevent the prolonged, sustained downward trajectory that you had in the 30s. And then, by 2020, they've streamlined it and undemocratized the process so much that it happens behind doors instantaneously, basically as a function of the nervous system. And you have no conflict, nothing ever. And so, at every point, you can say as a capitalist, look at this. Look at the system adapting, it's beautiful. We're reducing the violence of the system. We're reducing the inherent instability of capitalism. Okay, but what are you building as you're doing that? We went from 1929 till 2018 to have the first one, and then the second one. Then we went from 2008 to 2020. When the hell's the next one going to come then? And where do you go from maximum liquidity as the only response, which there is no alternative to? So while they're figuring this stuff out, and Lehman Brothers are going bust, and they're figuring out what the package is going to be, and they're begging guys to lend money, and they're basically the global banking system is dependent on the liquidity provided by drug money. Basically, it is laundered black market money, mostly like cartel coke money, that is still in the system, is still within the system as liquid that can be used for transactions. And while this is happening, there's a 40% drop in the S&P, 3.3 million people lose their jobs, households lose $14 trillion in net worth, there's an 8% drop in retail, 17% drop in capital investment, and GM loses $30 billion. And everybody else in the rest of the world is lashed to the mast of this fucking ship. Everybody else has a cascading crisis in their economies, their own collapses, their own bailouts that have to happen. And in all of this, that ratchet effect that pulls everything closer, even though it's heightening the contradictions of crisis, pulls in more U.S. dollars. Even in this context, the U.S. dollar is stronger because there's no good investment out there. Everyone's terrified of lending money. So where do they put their money? American Treasury bonds, the last resort investment. Because it's the U.S. state. Without it, there's nothing. So even though I doubt everything else, I still believe in the country with the giant military, the world's largest military, with the most nuclear bombs, at least the best ones. We have the best missiles. Russia might have more, but ours are better. Everybody wants these treasuries. So even now, America is what caused this thing. It gets reinforced. This is the dynamic of destruction that we're stuck in. And so globally, though, there is a coordinated response, and it's this global plan for recovery that the U.S. and the U.K. get together with. And they insist that it's a $5 trillion stimulus package. Every country sort of obligated to try to stimulate their in economies. So, and essentially to do global Keynesianism after the working class have left the stage of history. Because Keynesianism assumes a working class political power. Now we're post that. We're post Keynes in the sense that we're post working class political power. So in that context, the pump priming, the kind of investment that the state did in the 30s is replaced. It's not hiring people to do jobs directly. It is cutting taxes, and it's giving free money to banks. It's pouring it in at the top because they're the only people who have political power anymore. They're the only people who can articulate a political agenda and have their political representatives carry it out. So, of course, this money from the government to prime the pump, it goes in at the top only. But different countries, interestingly enough, do this in different ways. So China doesn't do that. China doesn't give a bunch of money to the top people. China puts out a bunch of money to smaller businesses in the form of bank loans and then spends $zillion on infrastructure. This is when they're building all those goddamn fucking maglev trains that we're all enraged to see every day on the internet. In America, that money was mostly tax cuts. It was some direct payment, mostly through contracts, no like WPA style thing, which actually does encourage working class mobilization. No, just diffuse through the system, and then a bunch of tax cuts. And then on top of that, quantitative motherfucking easing. On top of it all, more money, liquidity, baby. This is basically the same thing that like Zimbabwe did. But the thing is that if you're another country, if you're not America, and you try to increase, increase like standards of living in your country or even maintaining them by printing more money, that you will be punished. You will get hyperinflation. You will get down. But America, the indispensable nation, cannot be disciplined from outside of global capitalism. It doesn't make sense. So the Fed creates this infinite liquidity, which is what allowed for the instantaneous placing of the finger in the dike in 2020. There's not any backlash internationally because other countries can't. There is no point in punishing the United States because it cannot undermine the system that it is the cornerstone of, at least until now. Now, post-Trump, it's in an interesting place, and we'll talk about that. And these countries now, because of this cheap dollar, they're stuck with less valuable dollar assets and inflationary pressure in their own economies, but there's nothing they can do about it. But even with this, like you'd think, good deal for America? No, because there's still the U.S. government, there's still the Republican Party representing this lumpen reactionary middle class with this delusional understanding of its relationship to the economy. These fucking cosseted little piglets who think that their little fucking mom and pop store is why the economy works, as though it's not it's not totally extraneous at this point, as though they couldn't just like airdrop whatever bullshit you're making there in a pallet and just pay you to sit on your ass. They're letting you have your little job so you don't bother them. But they don't know that. They think that they're actually what makes the economy go. And they have a political party that exists to flatter them. And so it says, no, we're not going to bail out, find global systems. No, thank you. We're not going to pay this debt. And that creates this And that shows the tension between the U.S. as this sovereign government with a political structure that's supposed to serve its own political formations, and then its goal as manager of global capitalism. And this conflict they end the chapter with, and the book with, is what's going to shape capitalism for the rest of the 21st century. Not as in World War II, not was in the 30s and up to World War II, where there's a conflict between capitalist states over resources or whatever. It is now within states, within capitalist states. Now, of course, this was written before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think does show that there is, I think, points of conflict and friction are blown up in a way that I don't think they could have possibly predicted, because it's amazing to think of how relatively stable things felt in 2012 when this book was written to now. It's 10 years and it's been just a stunning trajectory. But even with things like, Russia, the fundamental dynamic that they point out here at the end is 100% true. We're now in a situation where we've got a country in the United States where we have a national bourgeois which is able to express dominant, in fact, force-backed political authority in conflict with the global capitalism that it is absolutely dependent upon, that it has no power, no structure, no authority without. All of those deeds are only backed by the system that capitalism, global capitalism, that they're in opposition to, facilitates. And of course, it's all expressed along cultural conflicts because they have no real, they cannot express a real rejection of capitalism because they are a product of it and their power depends upon it. They will never renounce it because the hierarchy it's based on is one that they metaphysically believe in. That's why they're willing to go to war with global homo, bite the hand that feeds them. And this is happening everywhere. You're seeing the rise of these domestic national bourgeois. And the funny thing is in the conclusion to their book, they say, this chapter here, this paragraph here, after decades of economic integration, there are no national bourgeois like those that supported the fascist turn in Germany or Italy in the interwar period. And what's wild is you might chuckle at that, but that was, I would 100% have agreed with that in 2020 and 2012. I would have said that is completely true. And now 10 years later, we're in a situation where you have these real conflicts now emerging between the necessity of maintaining American, specifically American, but others too, American political institutions and their legitimacy. Like the legitimacy of these institutions that will allow every other institution to perpetuate itself are under attack but from a political opposition that is unknowingly bashing at the foundations of their own power because they cannot see it. Because at the end of the day, there is no such thing as a clear-eyed class interest. Everyone has false consciousness. Because we have to have some notion of who we are as individuals and some value system associated with that. And yeah, there are pure psychopaths who look at life through a pure screen of bloodless positives and negatives, victories and defeats, accumulations and dominations. Most people have to tell themselves some sort of story about who they are. And that's just as true at the upper ranks of capital, internationally and nationally, and locally. And the American ruling class has been telling itself a story of godly dominion, of a holy hierarchy that is fundamental to the self-expression of people who, in these late days, have the only real coordinated influence in American politics because they command the cultural allegiance of the most thuggish, violent, and asocial people in this country, which, of course, are the police. So they point to this and they say at the end of the book, this dilemma is going to be resolved in only one way, by the alliance of class forces. That's going to be it, because whatever class is able to assert its control politically will be able to respond to the need, the unavoidable need for a fundamental restructuring of something. The restructuring has to occur. What it will look like will be determined by the array of class forces. And the working class is disorganized, can't conceive of itself as a class, and cannot collaborate with the national bourgeois the way that it could in the 19th or early 20th century. There is no more like left liberal professional class to ally with, and there are no more populist small holders to ally with. They have all been lost to the liberal mental breakdown of partisan politics, where the only goal is to see the opponent punished, is to see someone blamed and exquisitely and spectacularly injured and seen to suffer for the generalized misery. All right, that was a long one. Woo. But that was also the last one for this book. So that's the end of the book. I liked it a lot. Gave me a lot to think about. I hope sometime maybe later this fall to be able to talk to one of the authors of this book, Sam Gindin, who apparently has heard of the stream and has offered to talk. I'd like to talk to him. But I think right now, like, I'd have to do that with Chris, and Chris is on his honeymoon right now. So it'll be later, but so I'll keep streaming, I think, once a week or so if I can for the next couple of weeks. And either we'll have an interview like that, or I might start another book soon. I'm thinking First Class Passengers on a Sinking Ship by the Richard Lockman. But first, we'll just have some fun. Maybe do Q&A, get silly. All right. Bye-bye.